flip the script, turn it around so it goes to the other side. This thing about fear. It used to be, for example, the Democratic Party defended the Bill of Rights. You could always count on them, and the law and order guys that were on the far right, they would be trying to suppress certain things that are now perceived as criminal rights so that the wrong could be put in jail. And now you've got the left attacking the Bill of Rights and the right defending it, left trying to disturb freedom of speech, right to remain silent, search and seizure. And you can see it with what they did with Mr. Cosby, Dr. Cosby, and that conviction got very properly reversed for an egregious violation of the Fifth Amendment. So, I mean, what the hell? Nobody gives a damn about what the law says. And right now, we don't even have 10%, 15% of the Congress being trained lawyers when it used to be 85, 90% were. It's even lower in the state legislative bodies. And a lot of people, well, even judges and lawyers nowadays, only 25% have ever read the Constitution. Constitution isn't but 10, 12 pages long in a pamphlet. It's a lot shorter than what you have to read to pass your driving test, or at least a written test to get your driver's license. So people need to understand what that says. Now, we get stuck on stupid. Excuse the judge for pontificating. I guess that's kind of what I did for a long time. When I had an internship at a D.C. think tank, and I had to sit in the Library of Congress and study the so-called slave pamphlets that were on microfilm. And Willie Lynch started off with his earliest publication. I think it was 1708 they had in Congress. And he wrote a series of letters that were really printed pamphlets. And he was in Bermuda. He was a slave owner and raiser of slaves in Bermuda, and he traveled all over the American colonies that included Bermuda, Barbados, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and what became 13 colonies, and Canada, mostly in the south of what became the U.S., and he taught how to enslave folks. So there were Willie Lynch letters and pamphlets, and there were a whole bunch of them. And for the 150-year period that they stretched over up until basically 1860 or so, with the most recent set of slave pamphlets that I had to read and research, they all were consistent. It wasn't just divide and conquer. The secret was that you raised slaves like horses. And I had a ranch out in California where my ex was raising horses, and I had 15, 16 of them around the ranch at any given time. And the way you do that is when you buy wild horses, which you could get for cheap for breeding stock, wild Mustangs, secret, you cannot domesticate a wild stallion, but you can domesticate a wild herd mare. So what you did is when you domesticated the females, which was sometimes a struggle, but when you domesticated the females, she would domesticate her offspring for you. So if you had a foal that had a lot going on and you left the foal with the mama, you wouldn't have as much work to do to domesticate that horse as if you weaned that foal very early from mama and took it away from its mother. Then you would have a lot more work than you would have if the mama showed the offspring the paces. So they relied on the black woman to teach her children how to be good slaves. Now, one of the things that Willie Lynch advocated and was taken up was allow your fresh Negroes to run wild in your district. Watch them carefully. Figure out who the ones were that were going to be the chiefs. Get the leader get his assistant, pick out which one you were going to use to breed with, and then strip the other one naked, torture that one, have him sodomized by a freak in front of all the children and the women and the rest of the slaves. And the slave women would no longer look to their men for protection. So you just killed one of them and used the other one after you crippled him for breeding. And that way you would have the slave women exercise their selfishness to become grandmothers, which seems to have been a thing then. So they would raise their boys and girls to be good slaves so they would survive that long. And that was one of the secrets to slavery. Never deal with a mature or elderly slave male. Always deal with the elderly, mature slave females. Now, where did the men go wrong? Well, you had all of this territory from what was the eastern seaboard all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and a lot of Native Americans out there that black folk could have escaped and allied with, and it would have altered the entire history of the country. Something like what they did down in Florida with the Seminole Indians. You had the 5 civilized tribes: Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. And we could have done that, but the black men apparently didn't, not enough of them wanted to be warriors. And then a great deal of the reason why was you didn't catch too many warriors and make slaves out of them, though you did. And they tended to cause a lot of trouble when they got brought over here. Now, the slave trade in terms of importing slaves ended, I think it was 1807 by the Constitution. So you've got a problem with how they bred slaves. One of the most insidious things that I read, by the way, was this. Willie Lynch, not so much because it was very early, but later on, the slave masters were instructed to go in with their fellow slave owners and buy a stud. Now, there was a peculiar attribute they wanted this stud to have. They also wanted him to make a good preacher. So make the stud the preacher and allow slave marriage. So the slave male would find out that when his female wife, well, his wife was believed to be in heat, the slave masters would bring over the stud preacher to sleep with his wife, often on his pallet in his hovel.
Wow.
And that would do what now would be called demoralizing him. And the slave masters were told to attend the services regularly, not so much to eavesdrop on what the slaves were up to, but to watch this. And this was in those pamphlets over and over. When one of the slave women got happy and got to shouting and rolling on the floor and thrashing around, now they call it getting the spirit. They did then too. That meant that they were coming into estrus or were going to be fertile within 3 days. So make sure that the slave preacher would have sex with her so you could increase your livestock and your workforce. So, I mean, it was all kinds of insidious stuff. And then that carries over into now. I used to represent the Black Baptist Ministers Alliance, 35 some years ago around here. And I remember attending a seminar they were having on life insurance for the preachers. And this guy was saying that their actuarial table showed that black preachers tended to preach for about 50 years before they retired, assuming good health. So all of a sudden it clicked in my mind. This was back in the 80s. I said, oh man, wow. It's 1860 and they've got a 20-something-year-old black preacher who's a slave preacher. The Civil War hadn't started. He's been screwing all of the babes in the church. And he's going to preach from 1860 to 1910. When the preacher takes over from him in 1910, assuming one of these old Southern black churches, he's going to do the same thing that is daddy did, in this case, his predecessor. He's going to screw all of the women, and the grandmothers and great mothers of the church are going to be used to it. And this dude is going to be preaching from 1910 to 1960. So in 1980, the preacher that took over in 1960 would still have another 30 years to preach. And he would be in the position of being the grandson, effectively, of the slave preacher. And grandson's doing what dad did, what granddad did, and that screw all the chicks in the church. And when you see you see it once your eyes get open. It's like, we know about germs, right? So if you're in somebody's restaurant and the floor looks clean and some food drops on the floor, I mean, maybe you want to go for the 5-second rule, but most of us will just throw it away. But some people, oh, that's clean floor, let's eat it. No, there are germs down there. See, when you know what the germs are and you have an idea, you can see stuff that other folk don't see. And yeah, we have these slave pamphlets, and yeah, there was a Willie Lynch, and it was more than a letter.
In almost every imaginable way. The codes restricted enslaved people's ability to move around or engage in commerce that would make them financially independent. They basically restricted the very opportunities that would allow them to live with even relative freedom. When there were hints of enslaved people questioning their status, or even the possibility of someone planning a revolt, new slave codes were quickly passed to prevent such a thing from happening. Virginia was the first of the 13 colonies to implement large-scale slave codes. Since the United States was not quite the United States yet, each colony had their own version of these codes. At the time, they were not yet even referred to as slave codes, but even without the formal title, their purpose remained the same: to fundamentally restrict the rights of Black Americans, free and enslaved, and to explicitly deny them the rights afforded to white members of society. Let's take a look at an example. In 1662, Virginia passed this statute: whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother, and that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. After Elizabeth Key's case in 1656, which we talked about last episode, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed this official law. It mandated what's known as partis sequitiventrum, determining one's enslaved status based on their mother's labor status, as the legal method to determine whether an individual is enslaved